Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kelly Purse-Brossett. I'm the Strategic Communications Director for the City of Olympia. And on behalf of the City of Olympia, we're very honored to host you and host all the jurisdictions for this meeting. I'm going to start first by a little housekeeping and letting you know where the restrooms are. We have both men's and women's on the hallways on either side of the big lobby desk. The women's is closest to the chambers, and the men's is closest to the street side of the building. So feel free to make use of them. I also want to introduce some of my colleagues in this journey for franchise renewal. First of all, from the City of Lacey, Steve Kirkman, Public Affairs Manager, he's right there. From the City of Tumwater, Ann Cook, Communications Manager. From Thurston County, which is the lead agency in this, Michelle Underwood, Senior Management Analyst. And we also have a representative from Comcast amongst us, Hans Heckman, the Government Affairs Director. About this meeting, while we hope that you come away from this with a good and clear understanding of how local government franchise agreements with Comcast works and the opportunities it offers and the limitation it imposes, the real purpose of this meeting is for you residents to give us your thoughts, and for us, your local government representatives, to listen. And so that's why we're here today. To that end, a couple of things. A little bit about the agenda. I'm going to lower this because it's higher even for me. A couple of things about the agenda, the way this is going to work out. I'm going to turn this over to, I forgot to introduce the star of the show, Ken Fellman, who is our consultant working with all the jurisdictions. He's from Kissinger and Fellman, and he is conducting the work for the jurisdictions around the renewal. Ken is going to talk a bit about local government authority and the cable franchise renewal. We're going to open it up from Q&A for you guys, so you can ask your questions, make your comments. Ken is going to come back and talk about next steps, how comments and how your comments will be used, and we're going to let you go after that with a little thank you. Also, I want to remind you, out on the table out in the lobby, there are sign-in sheets, and that's really about us trying to track who's coming. Happy you're here. But also, if there's any follow-up that needs to happen, we want to know how to find you and how to get back to you. Also on the table are written comment sheets. If you'd like to submit your written comments tonight, you can hand them into any one of the local government jurisdictions, the folks I just introduced to you. You can also, if you don't want to do that tonight, you can mail them in or email them to us. All of our contact information are on those sheets, so please be sure to take one. And with that, I am going to hand this over to Ken.
Let's see, is this on? Sounds like it's on. Okay, good. I'm going to move around, so I've got this wireless mic, and hopefully this will work. My name is Ken Fellman. Nice to see you here tonight. We are starting this cable franchise renewal process. I work with local governments all over the country on cable franchising issues and other telecommunications issues. I'm based in Denver, so we're not going to talk about a certain Super Bowl game tonight. But I do a lot of work in Western Washington. I actually worked with these 4 communities on their last cable franchise a number of years ago. And I've been doing this for a long time, and the law has changed over the years. I want to give just a brief overview about what cable franchising is and what it isn't, and what we can put in a cable franchise and what we can't. And you will probably be frustrated at some of the things I tell you we can't do, and I will tell you that I'm equally frustrated, both as a representative of local governments and also as a consumer. But unfortunately, a lot of the answers to those frustrations are call your congressman or call your senator, because the local government inability to address those issues is a result of federal action. So I'm not going to take a lot of time, and I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds, but if you have questions, we can answer them. I think I only have 9 slides, so we have to go over here or go that way. All right, so what is a cable franchise? It's a contract, and it's an authorization from the city or the county to a cable operator that gives the company the authorization to use public rights-of-way and utility easements to put its networks. You have a private company generating profits for their shareholders, but in part they're using public property to do it. They need to get government authorization to do that. They do it in the form of a cable franchise. So local government grants the authority. In return for that, there are certain promises imposed. Is this going in and out? All right, let me move it up a little bit. All right, if it gets too loud, you'll let me know. So certain obligations that can be imposed upon or negotiated with a cable operator, one of which, the one that we think of often as the franchise fee, which you see on your bills, that's similar to the rent for the use of the public property. Franchising is kind of the strange mix that is governed in part by local law, because cities and counties are empowered under their state jurisdiction to grant a franchise authorization to use the rights-of-way. The federal law puts kind of a box around franchising, and you can only do what's in that federal box, and anything that's outside of it you can't do. And state law is involved to the extent that some of the things that you can't do in a cable franchise, you might be able to do in another franchise that's not cable related, depending upon your state law. But Washington is one of the many states that has limitations on what local governments can do. So there are factors of federal, state, and local law that that come into play here. And when we talk about a cable franchise, I'm talking about the video part of your cable package. Cable franchising does not involve, and state law does not permit, local governments to require the same kind of a franchise agreement with franchise fees and obligations about customer service on other services that are provided by a cable company on that same wire that runs into your house. You might get internet service from Comcast. You might get telephone service from Comcast. We are only allowed in a cable franchise to deal with the video part of that package. Just because I'm curious, how many people here are Comcast subscribers? Right. How many used to be but are not? Okay. Is it available to some of us in rural areas? No. Right. Okay. All right. How many are not but would be if it was available? Okay. Thank you for raising that point. So, let me start with some of the federal law limitations. I mentioned you can charge a franchise fee. The federal law caps that at no more than 5% of the gross revenues received from the cable part of the operation. Again, not internet, not telephone. I'm going to say that multiple times. You're going to get tired of hearing me say it, but a lot of people have concerns, and valid concerns, about their internet service. It's just not something we can address in a cable franchise. Cities and counties can require categories of programming that must be made available, but you can't require specific channels. So you can say you must have 2 different general news channels or 3 different general sports channels, but you can't say you must have ESPN2, you must have the Pac-12 channel, or you must have CNN. We can only require general categories of programming. Local governments can have customer service standards on cable franchise operators, and that's one of the only areas, I think maybe the only area of the federal law where local governments are allowed to impose regulations that are more strict than the federal standards. The federal government has customer service standards. They haven't been updated in about 17 years. And they still talk about things like you can't get a busy signal a certain percentage of the time. So that's how old the federal standards are. It's not always critically important that local government impose customer service standards, but if there's a consumer need for them, it's a tool that we have in the toolbox. We can require support for PEG channels, public education and government channels. How many of you watch any of your government meetings or any TCTV programming on your PEG channel? So many of you. That is there because of what we negotiate in the franchise agreement. And then there are other kind of standard issues that you always see in these contracts, how much insurance and bonding the company has to have. They're digging in the streets. There's always the potential for damage. Requirements to comply with local laws, indemnifying the city or the county from any damage they might cause. Many franchises have provisions for service to public buildings, certain kinds of reporting when there are legal matters that relate to the cable system, and then the ability to audit and require compliance. Those are all the kinds of things you generally find in a cable franchise. There are others, but again, this tonight is more about hearing from you than Cable 101 in law school. So here's a few things that we can't put in a cable franchise. I mentioned the first one before. I would love to put in requirements about internet service and voice service, but we can't. We can only deal with the video component. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, adopts technical standards for these systems. Local governments are not allowed to impose their own standards. We can enforce the federal standards. We can require compliance with the federal standards, but we can't come up with new standards. For the most part, we can't regulate rates. And when I say for the most part, when the first Cable Act was passed on the federal level in 1984, there was rate regulation. And then certain parts of rate regulation went away. They came back in a different format in 1992 when the law was changed. When the last time there was a major amendment to the law in 1996, most cable regulation went away. Local governments have the authority to regulate just the basic service tier rates, the very basic service tier. Most subscribers in most communities do not just subscribe to basic tier. They subscribe to some of the other tiers. And even with the basic tier, there's a provision in federal law for when you can lose that ability to regulate, and the cable company has to go through a proceeding at the FCC called an effective competition proceeding. I think that's a misnomer, because I think most of us as consumers would say, we really don't have the kind of that we'd like to see. That's a personal feeling that some of you may have. The FCC defines competition as if there's at least 15% of the people who can get video programming from another provider, including a satellite company like Dish or DirecTV, then you've got effective competition. You can't even regulate the basic rates. I know for a fact that Tumwater and Lacey, there have been FCC proceedings finding that they have effective competition there and they may not regulate the basic rates. I don't know that there have been those kinds of proceedings in Olympia and the county. Hans is nodding yes, so they have. I would tell you that even in communities that I work with that can do it, they usually don't do it because it's such a small percentage of the population that just takes the basic rate, and it's very, very complicated and technical to go through one of these analyses to determine if the rates match up with the FCC formulas, and usually you end up spending more money than it's worth in what you find. We can't, what happened to that last sentence? We can't charge franchise fees. Required is in-kind services that exceed the equivalent of what 5% of the cable gross revenues would be. So this may sound kind of facetious, but in the early days of cable in the 70s and the 80s, this actually happened. You can't say, if you guys want to use our rights-of-way and build a cable system, we want you to build a park over here or improve our library or anything like that. You really can't require that now, and if you do require certain kinds of in-kind services, even relating to cable, other than the PEG channel stuff, the cable company can credit that against the 5% franchise fee obligation. All right, do we have to grant a renewal? Not really, but sort of. And the way the federal law works is the statute says a cable company that has a franchise is presumed to have a right to a franchise renewal if They offer a new franchise that meets the future cable-related needs of the community. That's the magic words in the statute. And they demonstrate that they have the legal, the technical, and the financial ability to comply with a franchise that meets the future cable-related needs of the community. Comcast is a big enough company. They have the legal, technical, and financial ability to do anything they want. So the real question is, what are the future cable-related needs of the community? There's one court case I know of that came out of a federal court in Ohio that said it's not up to the city council by itself to determine what the future cable-related needs are. The council needs to get some information back from the public. That's why you're here tonight. So it's, this meeting is one part. The surveys that we're doing are one part of an effort to try to get a feel for how do we determine what the future cable-related needs of the community are. What are we doing to prepare for this? In addition to this meeting tonight, I think you've already been given the information about the online surveys. Please take the time to fill one out. If you haven't, tell your friends and neighbors, because the more results we get, the better range of feedback we're going to have. The jurisdictions are doing reviews of franchise compliance, which is another thing we do in this process. So there's currently underway a franchise fee evaluation by a financial expert to determine if Comcast has paid to each of the 4 jurisdictions what they are obligated to pay in the franchise fees and with the PEG fees. And there are certain ways we calculate those, because if you're a subscriber, you know if you get bundled services, some of them are internet, some of what you pay for is cable, some might be phone, but you pay one price for that. And how the company allocates that bundled price to cable, which the city or the county will get 5% of, is what is being audited, so to speak. And then we're also doing a technical audit where we have a company looking at the cable franchise network itself to see the federal standards and with the with local codes. TCTV, which is the entity that is this working better? Or I'm bumping the wire. I'm going to just hold this. How's that? TCTV is the entity that is retained to do the programming for each of the jurisdictions, and we are meeting with them about their future needs, what their capital needs are. One of the issues that will come up will be, and this is happening with many communities around the country, as the country shifts from standard definition channels to high definition channels, is the ability for citizens to watch their PEG programming in high definition, and those who have not yet made the change to still be able to watch it in standard definition. And then after we conclude this kind of needs assessment process, this isn't working out as good as I thought it was. All right. One of the things we need in the franchise is new microphones. All right, let me turn this one off so we don't get feedback. Right. Okay, how's that? Now that I'm just about done. We're going to conclude all this, and we're going to analyze all that information, and Kelly introduced all the staff members who are working on this, and we'll caucus, and we'll figure out what do we need, what do we have in the existing franchise, what needs to be changed, and then we'll start negotiating with Comcast, and we'll see how long that takes. Whoop, I skipped one too fast. What if we can't come to an agreement? I hear this every now and then. What if we just say we need to have this, and Comcast says no? So there are 2 ways you negotiate a cable franchise under federal law. One is what's called the informal process. That's what we're doing. If that doesn't work, there's a procedure in the statute called the formal process. Either party, Comcast or any of the jurisdictions, could say, we're starting the formal process. It almost never happens. Less than 5% of the time throughout the entire country do you see a cable franchise go into the formal process, give or take. It's very regulatory. It has all This is strike 3 if it doesn't work. Okay. in a formal franchise renewal proceeding, the statute sets out this kind of a needs assessment that we're doing, but it creates strict timelines. You have to do your needs assessment within X number of days. Then the communities have to issue a formal request for franchise renewal, saying what they need in a franchise. Then the cable company has a certain period of time to make its proposal. Then it gets analyzed. Then the elected officials, each of the 4 jurisdictions, would have a public hearing and make a determination whether they would accept or reject that proposal. Usually what happens in the rare occasions when formal franchises got to that point and a city council or a board of county commissioners said we are rejecting the proposal, that is followed by a lawsuit in federal court where the cable company asked the court to make a finding that the local government exceeded its authority and that they did in fact propose a franchise that meets the future cable-related needs of the community. And that's why you rarely ever see these things go to a formal process. So my very, very strong suspicion is that we are going to go through a negotiation that may or may not be difficult. It probably will have some difficult twists and turns. They usually do. And at the end of the day, we'll make the best deal we can, and we'll see what we can recommend to the elected officials and to the communities. So, Kelly mentioned that Hans Heckman is here from Comcast. Hans, raise your hand. He's going to have an opportunity to speak if he wants to. He's not obligated to speak tonight because this is about hearing from you. To the extent that you have specific questions that are Comcast questions that he might be able to answer, he may happily come up in the middle of the Q&A and answer them. We'll certainly let him do that. And if there are bigger issues, he may suggest taking your contact information and getting back to you after the meeting to resolve it. So we really appreciate your involvement. And where is Ann? Are you coming up to help? Are you going to be like... You're going to take notes. Steve... Okay. That sound good? All right. So I would just suggest anyone who wants to share some information with us, ask a question, tell us what you think, raise your hand. Steve will give you the mic, and we will take notes and answer your questions as best we can.
So I do have a question.
I'm sorry to interrupt I had to do that and interrupt the first one. Please tell us who you are before you make your comments and what community you're from so we know where you are.
My name is Vicki Adams, and I'm a Thurston County resident since 1993. Okay. So my question is for you directly. Can you explain why the limitation only for video? I mean, what's the history, or briefly?
Yeah, thanks for the briefly part. I used to, I sometimes teach a law school class in telecom law and policy, and we have 2.5-hour lectures just on this statute. But here's why. Because if you are as old as I am, or almost as old as I am, you may remember that there was a time where telephones had a certain kind of wire made out of copper, and the only thing that could go over that wire was voice. And when cable came along, there was the coaxial cable, the black thing with little silver things on the inside of it wrapped around a copper cord. And the only service that could travel over that was the video picture. And you had certain kinds of transmissions that were wireless, and you had over-the-air broadcast, and they were limited to certain kinds of frequencies. And as a result, the Communications Act, which is the overriding federal statute that governs these things, had different titles. And Title II dealt essentially with telephone service, and Title VI, when the Cable Act was passed, dealt with cable service, and Title III deals with wireless. And so you have 3 different regulatory frameworks for 3 different kinds of services. And once, about 15 years ago, when we started to be able to get internet over cable modems, all of a sudden you started having different kinds of technologies that used to only be able to do one thing that now could do multiple things. So you had certain kinds of services. When the telephone companies started providing internet, you had some on dial-up, you had dial-up internet coming over a copper wire that was governed under Title II of the Act, and cable had internet service coming over coaxial cable, and there's a question, well, is that governed under Title VI or is that governed under Title II? The bottom line is our laws have not increased anywhere close to the speed that technology has increased. And we still, to this day, have the 1934 Communications Act, which received its last major amendment in 1996. So we're now 22 years past that. And I mean, think about that. The 1996 Act, the last time we had a major rewrite of the telecom laws in the United States, and it was 125 pages, that law. The word broadband was used once in that bill. We weren't even using the term then, and now that's all that we talk about. So Congress has to change the laws and deal with these more holistically, because if you think about it, there's no such thing really as a cable company or a telephone company. They're all broadband companies. And video is an app on a broadband network, and voice is an app on a broadband network. The laws are just out of date, and it's messy, and we are constantly trying to put a square peg in a round hole because of that. And so that's probably longer than you wanted to hear, but that's why we have this problem. Somebody else has a question or a comment.
My name is Mark Dolan, Olympia, and Olympia's representative for TCM. Given what you just said, we're looking at 5G coming out, and we're looking at all these new services, OTT, IoT. So how do you go ahead and negotiate a contract with Comcast, who doesn't recognize any of these services? How do you encompass your negotiations for the next 8 years?
It's hard, and it's getting harder. So for folks in the room who are acronym shy, 5G. Everybody heard of 5G? Right? It's 5th generation wireless. 5G, by the way, is actually not going to be here for a few years. Nobody on Wall Street has decided that they're willing to fund 5G in a major way, so you have all the companies running around telling congressional representatives and state legislators that we're falling behind China in the race for 5G, we have to do something, and Wall Street hasn't even decided to fund it yet. And my guess is most consumers really don't care whether we're winning or losing a race with China, they just want better service and more competitive prices. So, but 5G is basically going to be faster, more robust, wireless with less latency. If you're driving a wireless car, less latency is probably a good thing. Yes, ma'am. The question was, does all Japan have access to 5G? I don't know the answer. I know that in some of the countries in the Far East that are smaller geographically and have much higher densities, they are pretty far ahead of us in a variety of telecommunications technology, not just perhaps with 5G, but also with fiber to the home and gigabit connectivity in everybody's home and business, which we're a long ways away from, at least at an affordable price. We have 5G, we have the Internet of Things, we have every one of the local governments here, like so many other local governments in Washington and throughout the country, are wanting to become smart cities. And you know, we hear that term a lot, smart city. It really should be smart communities, because it's not just cities. And that involves both private sector applications and public sector applications. But you don't get to be a smart city unless you have a really good broadband network to support sensors all around your community gathering data, and then really smart people to figure out what to do with that data to make your community work better. So you need networks for that. Keep in mind also, when you talk about wireless, there's no such thing as a purely wireless network. Every wireless network has to connect to fiber, and the more fiber you have into the wireless network, the more robust and fast and better speeds you're going to have. But we are faced with this situation where we can't cover any of that in the franchise. We are limited in this agreement to looking at the video part of what Comcast offers and trying to work out a contract that says Comcast can continue to use the rights of way to provide cable service, the video portion of its service offerings over its network, in return for X, Y, and Z consideration that it will give to the city. And we are not allowed to address those other issues, in part because of state law and in part because of federal law. And the federal government is poised right now to even further restrict the little bit of authority that local governments have over siting issues related to wireless facilities and some of these 5G networks that are going to be built, and what can be charged for putting antennas on streetlight poles and traffic signal poles. So there's this push where, and the industry has an ear in Washington, D.C. right now of saying, you know, if you just eliminate all these state and local regulations, we'll just be able to build all these great networks everywhere, and then everybody will have great service, and we'll have a wall on the southern border and peace in the Middle East, probably, if we get that done too. So, sorry, I'm starting to disclose some of my political biases. I'll try to do a better job. It's very, very frustrating, but we're limited in what we can talk about here. I'll use your question to just give you one other thought, and Hans can respond to it later or not. I look at this, look at cable franchising. You mentioned OTT, that stands for over the top. Have people heard of that phrase before? So over the top is you have a broadband connection from one company, but you can get your video programming from a variety of other sources online. You get it over the top of your internet connection. So you can be a Comcast internet subscriber, not buy the Comcast video package, and you might have Netflix or Hulu or Roku box or Sling box, whatever it might be, any combination thereof. That's not a cable system. That's not a franchise. If Comcast goes into a community and says, we're just going to provide internet, and these other content providers are selling ISP, selling services that you can use over your ISP's network, then that's not a cable system or a cable operator, and there's no franchise. The federal law defines the cable operator and the cable system. The company has to own or control both the infrastructure and provide the package of video programming, the packages of video programming that are offered over that. So as I look at where the future is going, and nobody can predict it perfectly, you know, these franchises usually are about 10-year terms. There was a period in time they were 15, there's a period in time they were a little shorter. But if we do a 10-year franchise, I think this is the last cable franchise that we're going to see in these communities, and I've told lots of city councils and boards of county commissioners that over the last couple of years. I don't know when cable franchising as we know it today is going to go away. It might be in 5 years, might be in 8 years, and maybe it won't be for 15 to 20, but it can't stick around the way it is now because technology is changing too quickly and the laws are out of date, and eventually Congress is going to have to get around to updating them. And at that point, we're going to be looking at an entirely different landscape.
I do have a follow-up question. It's my understanding that you will coordinate with Tumwater, Lacey, Olympia, and Thurston County for developing negotiation points in the contract. How are you going to coordinate this? Is this a monthly or quarterly meeting, or?
So we are going to negotiate jointly. It is possible that we will find that there may be Tumwater-specific issues here and there, or county-specific issues here and there. And we'll deal with those separately to the extent that we have to. I suspect that 90% or more of the franchise, if it works in one community, it'll probably work in the other communities. As far as the timing, and we're not going to set up regular monthly meetings. Usually the way it works, it's there's a benefit of pooling resources and sharing costs and bringing in like communities to do it together. That also creates more people on the team, which makes meetings harder to schedule. If we put together a franchise draft and I send it to Hans, he's going to look at it with his team. He's got people in his organization he's got to share it with. He'll take a few weeks and get it back to us with a bunch of comments and edits. Then we'll circulate it internally with our group. We'll probably have a conference call. We'll set up a meeting And by the time you get everybody together, you just can't predict that we're going to be able to do this every month. Sometimes you go 3 or 4 weeks and then you have another meeting. Oftentimes you go 6 to 8 weeks before you can set up another meeting. Usually the process, once you start negotiating, takes at least 6 months unless everybody's in an agreement and there's no major issues. I don't currently foresee, I don't want to preclude them, I don't foresee right now any really incredibly difficult, impossible issues, but we haven't sat down yet and decided, what are we going to ask for, and we haven't heard from Comcast, what are they, wanting to change from the existing agreement. So depending upon probably what happens by the time we have our first meeting, we'll have a better feel for how long this whole process is going to take.
My name's John Ackerman, and I am in the Thurston County area. So I have a two-part question. The first being, does the current and potential future franchise agreement dictate servicing of pre-existing lines that were placed by Comcast? And specifically, cost to Comcast versus cost to consumer. Who is responsible if there's a section of this in the current and future franchise agreement?
The current agreement requires that if a potential subscriber lives within a certain distance of the existing Comcast infrastructure, and I just forget how many feet that is, off 300, thank you, then Comcast is required to extend service, if that customer wants it, at its normal standard installation rates. If a potential subscriber is further away from that, Comcast is permitted to charge a fee to the individual person or business that wants the service to extend it. So we've come up with standard distances, they get standard installation prices, and then if it's further away, they have the right to charge the actual cost of extending the service. So it really is a case-by-case analysis.
Once that line already exists, though, and let's say that line were not maintained properly, who would be responsible to maintain the line once it already exists?
Well, Comcast is required to keep its cable system up to FCC technical standards. So if they put in a cable system and it's not being maintained, there's currently an avenue, even before we do the new franchise. If that's an issue in the part of the community that you live in, you should probably, if you live in unincorporated Thurston County, you should be talking to Michelle about it. And okay, all right. And
Hi, Michelle.
all right. I'm glad I confirmed what you guys already did.
You actually answered the second part of my question, which was who would I speak to, the mediating authority, and that sounds like it's Michelle for me, so thank you.
All right. I would tell you that the way that most local governments like to see consumer issues handled, and again, I've been a Comcast subscriber for a long time too, and not at times without frustration. Comcast, I know, has invested a lot of money over the years to improve their customer service operations, and in some cases, my personal feeling is they have, and based upon some experiences I've had recently, in some cases they still have a lot of work to do. But the bottom line is, I think we would prefer that if you have a problem with Comcast, call Comcast and see if you can get it resolved. If you can't get it resolved, or you can't get an answer and you need help, any of the people who are here tonight representing any of the 4 jurisdictions are the ones you should call and say, here's what I've tried to do. Here's why I'm frustrated. Can you help? And they will help. And usually what happens, I mean, again, 90% of the time, they'll call Hans or they'll call one of his colleagues who are not the people who are running the customer service desk and say, here's the problem. And once it gets escalated, Comcast can usually be pretty effective at helping get problems resolved.
Very briefly here, is that, would that line be considered customer-based or location-based? So if a previous subscriber had that line buried through Comcast, would that follow the property, or once a new subscriber moves in, would they now be responsible or would it stay with the property? Did you understand my question?
Yeah, I think I understood your question. I mean, if the line is there, then are you saying there's a line to the home?
Right. These aren't really hypothetical questions. This
Right,
this is the
I
reason I'm
picked
here.
up on that. Yeah.
You know what? And I'll talk to Michelle after. I don't want to get too specific into my situation. So you answer my questions. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Carl Young, Olympia. In the very, very beginning of the cable business, my recollection was the main selling point was no commercials, and Congress bought off on that. So now, sometimes I time about 1/3 of the programming is a commercial time. When did that commercial thing come in?
Well, I'm old, but I was not involved in this business at the start of cable. So I will tell you that my recollection is there's nothing in the Cable Act that said anything about no commercials. And I've been to the Cable Center and been to the Cable History Museum, and I know that a lot of the history of cable was getting television service to rural parts of the country that could not get over-the-air broadcast signals. That's where Hans's ultimate boss's father started his company in Tupelo, Mississippi, I think. And actually Brian Roberts, who's the CEO now, was climbing up poles and hooking up wires back in the day. So cable was to improve or to get video service to places where it wasn't. And I remember in the 70s, late 70s, how cool it was to get WGN in different parts of the country so you could watch baseball games when the Cubs played somebody. But they had commercials. It was just, you were just picking up WGN from Chicago. So I'm sorry, I just don't remember the no commercial part of your question.
The reason why I thought Congress signed off on this cable business is that you charge a fee for the service you're providing to the consumers, but because you're paying for a fee, there would be no commercials for the subscribers. I was thinking about the urban areas, not the outreaching areas. I seem to remember that, but
yeah. I know maybe it relates to your question that in the earlier days of cable there were different requirements on what percentage of the cable system had to be made available for non-commercial television or for local access, and maybe that's what we're thinking about or talking about, is that there were a certain amount of the cable system. I mean, and those were days where you'd get like 15 channels on your cable system, so you'd get NBC and CBS and ABC and your public television station, and then the super stations, and then you'd get a bunch of local programming. Maybe those were the non-commercial ones. As the capacity of these networks grew, there was never anything in the law I was aware of that constrained how they could grow, and there may have been some changes over the years that eliminated some of the local access requirements. It's not an part of the area of my expertise, so I just really don't know.
okay, one last question. We're trying to put together a security camera system in our community. We have about 285 homes, and the Privacy Act or the privacy issue came up. I contacted Comcast with a business account where they would install a camera for you, and they'll store about 30 days worth of video footage for you, that if you need to go back and find something, you have access to it. So the privacy issue is that who would be allowed to look at those images? Would Comcast personnel have access to that, or just certain people from our community or law enforcement?
So, I mean, that's a really good question, and it would apply whether the camera, the company putting up the cameras were Comcast or anybody else, and there's lots of companies out there that would do that. There are federal privacy laws that would apply to this if Comcast did it. and there were local customer service standards that governed privacy, that might address the issues. I do know, and I've dealt with some privacy issues with Comcast in connection with customer service. They have a couple of people in Philadelphia who are their privacy experts, and all the small print, when you see any of their commercial contracts about privacy, that's where that stuff comes from, and you've got to read it really, really carefully. I'm not a privacy expert. I know that ultimately federal law, there may even be some state consumer laws that would affect privacy, but there is probably language in their standard terms and conditions that says they won't use any of that information for commercial purposes, and they will restrict their use of it for, and there'll be some language about necessary and reasonable uses for their business purposes, and there'll be enough wiggle room in that language that you won't know exactly what that means. And if you try to pin it down and say, we're going to amend this to say, you can't do this or you can't do that, it'll be hard to get them to change that language, and that's probably not unique to Comcast. If you had some private company that was offering the same thing and you didn't like the way their standard language worked, they probably wouldn't want to change it either.
So can somebody from Comcast provide me with some documents or links? We have a board meeting coming up in a few weeks to decide whether or not to use Comcast as a service provider.
Hans, you want to respond to that? Maybe you can take his information and put him in touch with the right people.
Thank you. Is that working? Good to be here. I would just say, generally speaking, so far, I agree with just about everything Ken has said. You've got a very good...
He never says that.
Trying to score some points for later on, because he can be tough. No, honestly, I've done deals with him before. We work with him all over the country, and he's one of the good consultants that are out there. So you're very well represented. And again, generally speaking, I'd say I agree with everything that he portrayed tonight. A lot of things to address. Let me start just about on your question. You know, I'm not an expert on our security services or systems. I don't think we're in the business of surveilling public spaces, right? So if you're buying a service from us for security, it's going to be for your individual home or residence. So if you've got a community center or something like that, we do sell that, but that's more of a commercial application. And with regards to the privacy issue, that it's talking about that service, cable service, internet. There's federal laws around that, around privacy for all of those services, and our policies comply with all of those laws. We're a national company. We sell these products across the country. So generally speaking, that's where we're at. Don't know the specifics of that service, and neither am I a privacy expert, but that's probably the best answer I can give you for right now on that one. And Ken is right. A lot of laws that we are dealing with and the construct that we're under today is very dated. The Telecom Act dates back to 34. Cable Act is 84. A couple amendments there in 92. 96 was the last one. All that to say, yes, it's time for Congress to act on that and many other issues, right? And so until then, we are left with the law as it stands and what we have to do. The good news is, if you look at where we're at today, things are actually pretty darn good. The 96 Telecom Act, what it did was it motivated providers of traditional services to get into each other's businesses, right? So it allowed the phone companies to get into the video business, it allowed the cable companies to get into the phone business. And then there's this new thing called broadband, which, as Ken pointed out at the time, nobody knew really what service that was at the time. So, you know, phone companies generally kind of sat on their hands, right? They're governed under Title II, rate regulated, monopoly type of service, guaranteed rate of return, and that's what they had been living with for decades. Cable has never been that way. It's always been 100% private capital going out and building, which is going to tie into your issue here in a moment. So unlike the phone companies, there's no universal service fund for us. So the reason folks out in the rural areas have phone is because phone companies are able to tap into that to go ahead and provide the service, even though there's really no business case to do it. There's no return on that build. Cable doesn't have access to that. So again, everything that we spend we've got to get some kind of return on investment on that. We don't have a pool of money, like an insurance pool, if you will, which is what USF is, to draw on to take care of those folks maybe that are farther out. But in terms of the response back to the 96 Act, again, phone companies kind of just sat on their hands. They never thought anybody went more than dial-up. And while they were interested, I think to some extent, in the video business, I know when AT&T bought us at one point, AT&T Broadband, I can tell you someone who was there, they were really interested in getting back in the local phone business. They weren't so concerned with video and didn't seem to be too concerned with broadband. So their stint in that only lasted a couple of years. But by and large, cable responded well. Number one, knew they had to reinvest and upgrade their networks for their core product, that being video. Had a desire to get into this local telephone business as well. And then we're really interested in this new thing called broadband. And it was 20 years ago we launched broadband over cable modem. And we launched 1.5 meg at the time, which was way more than what the phone companies were doing, and went on from there. So today, where we stand, and again, it gets back into some of the things we talked about earlier with 5G and stuff, that is coming. We talk about Japan and with services they have. Good news is, folks, you all have a gig to your house today. You have since last October. If you want a gig, we can provision it. $125. So we have been investing, cable has been investing over time, taking that 1.5 meg service up to where today we have various tiers. You can go from 25, I think, to 60. Then we got 150, 250, 400, and then a gig, which is 1,000. So that is available and capable of being delivered over the coaxial cable that's coming into your home today. So when it comes to that, I think we've done a really good job in terms of pushing broadband here in America, and where we're at today has largely been based upon free market, investment, et cetera. It doesn't come necessarily with a lot of regulatory oversight. And again, I just used that construct going back to 96, two very different animals, and how did they respond to the environment and technology. So again, I lost my train of thought. There's a lot of questions that came out here tonight and things I wanted to address. With regards to video, I would say this too, well, with all our products. We just put in a new store last year over the Target Shopping Center on Harrison. Go in there and check out our products. If it's on the video side, look at the X1 and look what that does for you. Very slick, very intuitive. You just talk to the remote, you tell it what you want, boom, it pulls it up. And you know what? If you want our competitor in Netflix, that's fine. We've got them embedded right there on the dashboard, as well as YouTube, right? So that's another we talk about over the top. We recognize there are competitors out there, not just in Dish or the satellite providers, or not just in CenturyLink where they have provided video. Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, Apple, those are all folks that are getting into the video space that we're competing with. But with that, we do recognize that they've got good content that our customers want. So rather than you have to make the choice of toggling between the inputs on your TV, we just put it right there on the dashboard for you. So I encourage you to check that out, as well as on our internet service. Again, our Wi-Fi gateways, the XB6, something you might want to check out. Very smart and intuitive. If you set it up, there are two bands of Wi-Fi, 2.4 gigahertz and 5.0 gigahertz. 2.4 is the one that Wi-Fi really first rolled out on. It's what all the devices were using, but it's the most congested. But it does have the farthest range. 5.0, much faster, shorter range. Our devices are smart enough to where they will optimize, depending on the device you're at, where you're at home, as to which band you should be on to deliver the best experience for you. So again, another opportunity to check that out. Our home security products are there as well. And that store was just put in last year. So with that, let's just, yeah, please.
Is there any assistance for potential rural customers? Because we've been in a really frustrating situation where, like 2 years ago, we called Comcast and we asked for a quote for service, and we were told that figure was going to be $120,000. And that's a huge figure when you pay $270 for a house and you're raising a young family. We're 5 minutes off of I-5, exit 95, Little Rock Elementary School area. And then, so get this, then we went to completely unserviceable. We were told by Comcast we were completely unserviceable, no amount of money would do it. Come this spring, we were told the magic number was $87,000. We got a high-level We got a high-level estimate quote. $87,000 is still a lot of money, but we had us and other interested neighbors that were going to fork the money out and put in escrow. But the problem comes in the county franchise agreement. We can't freeze people out because the county and Comcast owns that infrastructure, even if we were to pay $87,000 for that. So that's a huge problem. I mean, there's a lot of rural customers that aren't being serviced, and we're not even that rural. I mean, I don't consider 5 minutes off of exit 95, I-5, the main. I mean, it's just a really frustrating situation. And I know this is a first world problem, you know. I mean, we have a Verizon jetpack, so we do have internet. So we're meeting that, I think, 15% or whatever that gets internet. And I know this is more about cable versus the internet and Wi-Fi part of things. Yeah. But is there any county grant money? Or, I mean, is there anything that's going to help rural people out there that, you know, really desperately want Comcast services but can't access it?
Yeah, no, not at this time. I mean, I think there's, and Ken is probably a little more up to speed on this than I am, but, you know, there is talking at the federal level about shifting USF, that's called Universal Service Fund, which the phone companies have had for years, right? Because it was a recognition, hey, you need a phone. If the fire's burning your house, you got to be able to call. So we all, as part of that, right, everybody pays into this fund to subsidize those bills that is never going to be paid back by the folks that are being served. And there's talk about shifting it over to help on the broadband side. I don't know, Ken, that anything has actually materialized on that front yet.
I don't think that anything has, but there are occasionally programs through the FCC. I don't know what kind of internet connectivity your schools have and who they have it from. They have Comcast? Okay, so here's this. Have you talked to Michelle about your, all right, so give your name and address to Michelle. I certainly don't want to promise you or anybody else who has an issue tonight that we can.
So, I mean, I can't imagine it going much further.
Well,
no offense. I mean,
all right, well, yes, no offense taken, and no offense to our state legislators, but they don't have a whole lot of say here. But it may be that let's look at where your neighborhood is, and we can find out how close the network is, and we can at least get, you've gotten multiple answers, it sounds like, to the same question.
We have a local rep now out of Puyallup we worked with who's came on site. So yeah, we've gotten very far, but it took us a month of calling we called the call center for a month straight every single day and got bounced back and forth between Fife and I believe Portland were the nearest, and you get bounced, you don't ever get the same. There's no direct, I mean, it was it took us literally 30 days of every day, probably a good 60 hours of my time dedicated to actually getting our local contacts. So,
okay.
I mean, it just seems like there should be some means of communicating with Comcast that are a little bit more straightforward than that.
All right, so as with any big bureaucracy, whether it's a public or private entity, sometimes we get frustrated when we're doing that, and I do not mean to downplay any of your frustrations. I completely respect them. But Michelle is your contact person in Thurston County government, and at least we can hopefully establish a point of contact who's the right person at Comcast that we can talk to. We may not get the answers that we'd like. We may or may not be able to address the issues in line extension policies in the next franchise agreement, but at least we'll know that we're talking to the right people and getting a straight answer.
I think we have our answers, but is there a reason why the franchise agreement won't allow us to freeze out our freeloader neighbors that won't pay the cost?
Well, I don't think it will. When you said that the county would be a part owner and I'm confused by that. So let's talk more about that offline outside the. Okay. Well, again, if you can get that to Michelle, it may not be 100% accurate, or maybe it is, and I'm just not understanding it based on the way that you're describing it. But it's something that we will look into further, and it may not be the final answer.
Thank you.
Hi there. I don't have a question, but more comments. My name's Andrea Capera. I'm from Thurston Community Media. And I just want to thank everyone for putting together this public meeting so we can have the opportunity to hear input from our community. So we're really excited at Thurston Community Media to be able to boast that for more than 30 years we've provided government coverage of government proceedings, community events, and high quality training for our community in digital literacy and supporting civic engagement. And in 2017, we produced 3,500 hours of locally originated programming. We served 70 youth in our youth media program, and we taught 58 courses in HD studio production, field production, camera operation, video editing, and animation, just to name a few. And so I'm here to make recommendations from our organization, share that with the public and our jurisdictions regarding the obligations that Comcast has to for use of our publicly owned right-of-way. So we'd like to ask that the agreement continue the 5% franchise fee, and that the facility and operations, the facility for operations and utilities are included in the franchise for the duration of it. An additional 2,000 square feet in addition to our 5,000 square feet would allow us to expand programs like our youth media program beyond the summer. And we need sufficient funding to provide for equipment replacement, upgrades, additions throughout the franchise. Comcast provides this at 30 cents per subscriber. We recognize that as our equipment needs change, construction and renovation needs change, that rate may not be enough. We also need 4 HD channels and the equivalent bandwidth to support that distribution of HD content. And if that method of distribution should evolve beyond those cable channels, we expect to access those types of services that any cable or broadband provider has access to. We'd love to see that all of those live access points are upgraded to HD in the future franchise. We also recognize that viewers need to know what's airing, so we need to see the programming produced by Thurston Community Media listed on the electronic programming guide. We'd also like to see that programming on Comcast On Demand. And finally, we purchase 50 megabytes per second of internet service. We'd like the next franchise renewal to include 100 megabytes up, down, fiber, so we can continue to support distribution, but be current in those distribution methods. So thank you for the opportunity to provide comment and share with you what we need to continue to provide service.
Let me ask you, and not, you don't have to do this tonight, but based on lots of other experiences, even in working with you guys last time, it would be very helpful for the 4 jurisdictions if we had a pretty comprehensive, at least 5-year budget plan showing what other, in addition to what your plans are, what your needs are, your capital needs, other sources of revenue that you might access now. And frankly, it would be very useful to compute. I talked about the need to meet the future cable-related needs of the community. One way to demonstrate the PEG, future cable-related needs of the community, is to sort of put in context, what are we asking for Comcast to contribute versus what are the other sources of revenue that govern the operations of Thurston Community Media. So that would be very helpful to get that information before we sit down in negotiations. Certainly, I'm not going to get anywhere with him unless I have something to give to him to show. I mean,
Absolutely.
he knows what a great job you do because you've been doing it for a long time. But as far as what's going to happen in the future, we need to look at plans and where that's going to go. I have one question for the audience. For all of you who raised your hands who said you watch Thurston Community Media, how many of you are high-definition cable subscribers? What?
I live in an area where we can't.
Okay, how many of you, let me do this again. Who watches Thurston Community Media program, any kind of Thurston Community Media programming? So, all right, almost everybody here, and I know there's a few people here who can't get Comcast. Of those of you who watch it, how many of you watch also or subscribe to high-definition channels? So about half.
I think we've also heard from other folks in the room that the real challenge is access to a cable line in the first place.
Well, yeah, that's so obviously we have multiple issues. For the people who don't have it, we need to talk about, you know, how do we get it. For the channels that are being watched now, where somebody does have high definition, well, let me ask it this way: for those of you who watch high definition channels, how many of you watch once you're watching high definition? Do you watch almost exclusively high definition channels, or do you go back and forth and watch some of the standard lower quality definition channels?
That question itself, Ken, what you're asking, is if you looked in the best of light, is not properly put. Because what do you do when you don't have Thurston Community Media and other great local programming in high def? How could you watch it?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at, right? So let me not ask a question, and I'll just tell you what is running through my mind.
Please.
I know what my family's practices have been, and I've talked to lots of my friends, and I've been at lots of discussions with lots of communities in different parts of the country, and at least what my non-scientific research has determined is that once you start watching in high definition, that's almost all that you watch. If you're scrolling around the higher numbered channels and you're watching NBC and ESPN and the Seahawks game and the Mariners game, you don't go back to those low channels. But if you like watching your government programming and your community programming, and that's the only way you can get it, you actually have to think, I've got to go back down to those lower channels. A lot of people, some of you who may watch a lot, you know what the channel numbers are, and you can go get it. But a lot of people, so this started in the early days of cable. The reason we wanted low number channels, a lot of people found their council meetings because they were scrolling through channel 4, 7, 9, 11, and oh, there's my city council meeting. I'll watch that for a while. People who are in high definition doing that kind of scrolling are never going to find their community media unless there are high definition channels. So one of the things that your government representatives need to know through your comments here, through people who are responding to the surveys, through any other kind of written comments that you want to make, is how many people value Thurston Community Media and want to watch it in high definition? At some point, and this is another one of those, I don't know if it's going to happen in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, there's not going to be standard definition. It's all going to be in high definition. And at whatever point Comcast and the other big cable companies say, we're now going to all high definition, then Thurston Community Media will be in all high definition. But because there's this transition period, just like there was a transition from black and white to color, where you've got people watching both, many communities have said, we need high definition channels, just like what we just heard. And one of the things that's important to us as negotiators is how much of the community believes that. Right? I know why Thurston Community Media believes it, and I agree with them. But I don't get to determine what the future cable-related needs of these communities are. You do, and your neighbors do. So if people think that that's important, then Michelle and Kelly and Ann and Steve need to hear about that. And we've provided some opportunities for you to get them your feedback. Yes, sir. What?
Thank you, Ken, for putting it in a better way. And as being a communication engineer myself, also the vice president of Thurston Community Media, TCTV is the old name. We changed it a few years ago. So now it's Thurston Community Media because we don't have the programming broadcast old model. So we are a media company, not a TV traditional broadcast. As being a vice president, board director, and having my background in communications, engineering, and understanding what you said, that once people get used to that high def, it is hard to go back to lower def. It's just, human psychology. Being a mental health specialist, I understand that also very well. So there are two things. Right now, we're producing our equipment, which is falling down. Last night, I was there for over 4 hours, from 10-year-olds, 11-year-old, all the way to nearly 70-something-year-old, trying to produce community media. Our equipment is old. Our recording equipment was broken down. So just the frustration it has. So I just want to bring 2 points. One, we produce, all the media we've been producing is in high def, but Comcast would not give us enough bandwidth to, be able to, so the viewers can watch it in high def. So we have to go back and do reformatting, spend hours and hours, every single person have to do. Our mission is that our communities be able to tell their stories. That's what was happening last night. So from 10 and 11-year-old to 70-year-old, this is like 12 females. We are in the studio, and our equipment has issues, and then we have to do formatting, bring it down, and all that other stuff, which takes up the next all night and stuff other for our volunteers. So we need to have tools so that our community we can nurture our community and prosper. So those are the 2 things which need to be really looked at. Thank you.
No, I just said the other piece of all this, right, is it's community's needs, and it's also its willingness to pay. It's the cable customers that pay. So everything that goes into TCTV is ultimately paid for by the customers. It's an itemized thing on the bill. Look at your bill, you see 30 cents. If this city is like most every others, every one of these cameras, the microphones, everything is paid for out of that PEG fund. I may be a little wrong here, Kelly, but typically that's the way it works. You're nodding, yes. Cable customers pay, right? So 30 cents every customer, and I wish I would have come with our subscriber numbers. I don't remember off the top of my head. But there are thousands of dollars coming in every month to support this stuff. Ultimately, wherever we end up with this, that's just, the other part of this is the willingness to pay factor. So.
I just want to clarify that point and say that the PEG and franchise fees that Comcast pays to the jurisdictions is for use of our publicly used right-of-way. So you pass on that fee onto the consumer, but ultimately it's Comcast's obligation to pay for the use of the right-of-way.
Yeah.
The law is very specific. Those fees and taxes can be itemized and broken out on the bill. And as a consumer, I think that's a good thing, right? The franchise fee is for the administrative costs to the cities and the county associated with our use of the right-of-way. We don't see it as rent, but we are paying the maximum amount under federal law, which is 5%. That goes to the general fund of the county and the general funds of the cities. I don't know how much of that comes back to TCTV. That's your negotiation with them based upon the services you provide. All of the PEG fees can only be used for capital, cannot be used for employee expenses or anything like that. So that's what we're talking about. The cities can use that for the cameras and microphones in their council chambers, but the rest of that all comes to you because you're the only one who can spend it on that capital.
Let me give you, the audience, a little bit slightly different perspective on that. Everything that Comcast has to spend money on, we pay for if we are Comcast subscribers. You don't see the breakdown. You get a bill of your bundled packages. You've got the, second tier level of high definition programming and 170 channels, and you get 250 megabits of internet service, and maybe you have phone service and maybe you don't, and you pay X $100 a month for that. And then you get a breakdown and you see sales tax and utility tax and FCC regulatory fee and 911 fee, and you see the franchise fee and you see the PEG fee. The federal law says, Hans is right, and this is not uncommon to other kinds of even utility companies, that government fees and taxes may be put on a bill as a line item. That doesn't mean that it's not a cost of doing business just the same as what Comcast pays ESPN to be able to put ESPN programming on the cable system. You just don't see in your $187.50 a month in your bundled package or your $225 bundled package a month how much of that is going for ESPN. You don't see how much of that is going for the stock options that the senior management in Philadelphia is getting. But everything that you are paying for is going to cover every single one of their expenses, the rent on their buildings, their health insurance that they pay for the employees, the computer networks that run their customer service centers. It's all part of that bill that you pay. The only thing that's broken out is what the state and local and federal government charges them on the bill. It's their obligation to pay it, and they have a legal right to put a line item on the bill, so as consumers we know what our government is making them pay to provide service to us. To me, it's all just a cost of doing business, and I would rather see how much am I paying for the Home and Garden channel, which I never watch, and how much am I paying to watch Rockies baseball games. I don't get to see that, but when it comes to Thurston Community Media, if we want 4 HD channels, there's a certain amount of money per month that, as part of the overall total amount that's on all of everybody's cable bills, we're going to be paying. My suspicion is, based upon what I know as to how much certain channels cost, ESPN, by the way, is the most expensive content provider. But there's lots of far less expensive ones. And the amount that you pay on your bill for Thurston Community Media is not unlike the amount that Comcast pays for some of its lesser watched programming. That's sometimes if they want to buy a popular channel from a content provider that's not affiliated with Comcast, they can't buy it unless they also agree to buy some of the other stuff that content provider wants to sell, which are much less expensive. So, and that's why people say, how come I have to buy these packages with 170 channels when I only watch 15 of them? That's why. Just remember when we talk about if we want more in the franchise, we all have to pay more. That is true. The difference is that they have a legal right to tell you how much you're paying of what the government is imposing, while they have no legal obligation to tell you, and they don't want to tell you how much you are paying based on what they have to pay ESPN and what they have to pay for their health care coverage. Other questions? Can we get the mic back? Oh, I'm sorry. You had a question first.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I want to get too much into that line item stuff, because if I'm not mistaken, when I read my bill, I am paying taxes and fees, you know, for my own, for me personally. And then those taxes and fees line items that are Comcast responsibility, I am also paying for that as well. Is that correct?
Well, that we can wordsmith this to death. That's one way to look at it. I don't think that's an accurate way to portray it. To me, everything that Comcast has multiple different kinds of costs of doing business. They've got to pay employees, they've got to acquire programming. Some of their own companies make programming, and maybe they get that at a better rate, but they acquire it from companies they don't have. And they have to pay government fees and taxes, including franchise fees, including utility taxes in some places. All of those things are a cost of doing business that they are obligated to pay. So the sum total of everything on your bill, to me, is the obligation that we all have as consumers to pay that amount, and it's repaying them for all of their costs of doing business, plus some profit that they've determined we can increase this bill somewhat amount over our costs of doing business so we can make a profit for our shareholders, and they get to make those decisions as to how much the market can bear.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jose Gutierrez Jr. I'm a resident of Thurston County, Hawks Prairie, and also a great friend of Thurston Community Media, and a member there since I was 12 years old. And I just wanted to say, I'm just listening, and I just want to just say some words for the record, that I would really encourage everybody here to go back and research the 1934 Communications Act and see what President Roosevelt and the dutiful citizens wrote then and why they wrote it. Because I'm just a bit disturbed at how much leeway is given to corporations and the criticisms of how old these acts are. And I think some of these acts were old and written at the time for a good reason that I think we've lost sight of. Even the 1996 Telecommunications Act was a clear disaster for diversity and creativity and diversity of ownership in the media, a very lopsided benefit that benefited heavyweight corporations. Not that this affects this conversation specifically, but I'm just saying in general, these are things worth revisiting, if not have been visited before by everybody here. Because the 1934 Act was for you, really for you. And when you go read it with the problem you just stated that you're having in your part of the community, that act was designed for consideration, security, and coverage of citizens and how we receive and transmit communications. So I don't want to lose sight of that, because I think there's a rush right now, and with a juggernaut like Comcast, people are intimidated. People would rather not take that 5% formal process and lose coverage than just accept it, just eat it, just do it, take it, and move along. And I just don't want, I'm just saying this for the record, because Olympia is not that kind of community to just take it and eat it and move along. And I think, this is a clear sign that people should mobilize and inform community members to not just be aware of this kind of process in the upcoming meetings. And it's not to vilify Comcast or anything like that. Comcast does business as it's supposed to. Any corporation's first priority is to make money for a shareholder, not necessarily out of concern for any customer. So just to be aware, of these factors. These are simple factors that I think we just kind of gloss over and we just take it, eat it, move along. And I just would encourage the Olympians in the Thurston County and Lacey and Tumwaterites and everybody else just to not be one to be just pushed along in any process. And sometimes that 5% is a good place to be. So you're not just moved along. But then you regret it later. So I just wanted to say some words, and I appreciate the officials here with their perspective and everybody else's voice.
Thank you for your comments. Other questions or comments?
I'm Mark Dolan again, still the same one. 1934, yes, there was the Telecommunications Act. 1984 broke up the Bell system, Judge Green. 1996 was a groundswell. That's where local number portability came in, where you could take a telephone number from one carrier to another carrier, and that was in the U.S. and Canada. I was there. Now, I do have a question after that comment. How does Washington Utility and Transportation Commission fit back in with Comcast and TCM? Is there any connection, or is that strictly FCC?
Hans may have a different view. My understanding of it is that WUTC has no role here with respect to cable services. When I mentioned during my initial presentation that there's functions of state law, federal law, and local law, essentially, in most states today, some states have taken franchising away from their local governments, but in Washington and in most states, local governments have the right to franchise cable companies. And the state stays out of it with respect to cable, and the federal government puts those parameters on where you can't step over the line. Where the state law comes in is where the state says, but you can't franchise other kinds of services in those same ways. When we're talking about the video stuff, the cable franchise, the state really does not have a role. You agree with that? Yeah. Yeah. 22 states have taken local franchising away from their cities and towns and counties, and 28 still have it.
Are you able to comment on the pending lawsuit by Attorney General Bob Ferguson against Comcast, alleging that Comcast basically fraudulently added on a payment service protection plan. I understand that's pending, so I'm not sure if you're able to comment, but I'd appreciate some information if you are.
All I know is that it's out there. None of my clients have asked me to be involved in it, so I know about it what I read in the news or hear about in the news or talk to my colleagues about. I don't know.
Yeah, it's pending litigation and
Right.
So I don't have any more further questions. I just have a couple of comments. So once again, my name is Vicki Adams, and full disclosure, I am an employee of TCTV, Thurston Community Media, but I'm not here representing them. I'm here as a Thurston County resident. So what I have noticed is that media consolidation is happening all over this country. And I believe it is extremely important now more than ever before to have input from local sources. As Andrea stated, Thurston Community Media does deliver local programming such as city council, county commissioner meetings, parades, video voter guides, and the procession, just to name a few. And we are unique because we also provide training, equipment, and facilities that do empower individuals and groups within our community. And the reason that I say that we're unique is because I know that there are PEG stations that are only government. There is no community to it. So, or there is no public, associated with it. So I just wanted everyone to be aware of that. And then another point that I wanted to make, once again, high definition is the current broadcast standard, and our channels are currently in standard definition, which brings difficulty not only for our community producers, but also the engineers on the other end of Comcast, if I'm not mistaken. Then further, once again, should the method for content distribution change beyond traditional cable channels, we must be able to access emerging distribution platforms that will be available to other cable and broadcast content providers. Lastly, I would like to thank the City of Olympia for providing this forum, and to all of the jurisdictions, as well as Comcast, for their support. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we set this up to go to 8 o'clock. We don't have to stay to 8 o'clock. And I'm actually willing to stay later if people still have questions and want to talk to me. So we'll see if anybody else has anything to add. Yes, sir.
My name is Andy Laren. I'm a resident in Lacey, but I've been in the Tumwater, Olympia, Lacey area for about 35 years now. And I didn't even know this meeting existed until just a couple days ago when I saw a blurb with no details in the Olympian. So I thought I'd come in and check it out, because I work in cybersecurity, and the internet and cybersecurity and all this stuff is very relevant to me. And I was honestly hoping to come in and talk about some of the ethical things that have come up in relation to Comcast, lots of lobbying against net neutrality, pricing schemes, all this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, it looks like that's not relevant to this particular discussion. This is about cable TV. And much as I would love to discuss these other things, that's kind of a side note to the ultimate purpose here. So, I mean, I don't want to waste time redirecting the conversation in a way that won't ultimately help the purpose here, but I did notice one thing that is relevant to this conversation. I noticed that you have a clause about supporting the needs of the community as it develops. And in here it even acknowledges provisions related to new developments, when the cable operator must extend to serve new developments. I'm curious what that includes, because I know the area is in a very big economic boom. We're seeing lots of new housing moving in, lots of new businesses coming in. What is included in the current agreement? And then another caveat to that, there's a lot of existing communities that are around the area. Is there any kind of a clause that might add in as the community expands more? When might they be required to provide service to an existing area that might now be within range?
Really good questions. Let me just briefly comment on the first part of your comments. I don't think any of the government representatives who are here tonight think any of those issues that you mentioned are not important. I certainly don't, and I have a lot of my opinions about them. But you're right. We're here to talk about this limited area because that's the project that we're engaged in now, and frankly, the federal law doesn't allow us in the context of a cable franchise to do that. So to those of you who feel strongly about those issues, talk to your mayors and council members and commissioners and their staffs, because it doesn't mean that those issues are not important, right? Okay, as far as line extension policies, and this applies whether it's a brand new development or whether it's a development that may have been 2 miles away from the rest of the community 10 years ago, but because of encroaching development, now it's adjacent or getting a lot closer. There is language in the franchise, and I apologize for not knowing the exact number, that basically it's a density requirement, that if 30? Okay, if what Hans is saying is if the plant in the area is aerial, if there are 30 homes per mile of plant into the new area that you want to extend service, I'm sorry, 60 if it's aerial. No, 30 if it's aerial. If it's 60 if it's underground, more expensive. Then, so if you have a new development and you've got a mile of nothing until the new development, but it's a big development, and you've got miles and miles of streets and hundreds of homes, and you just add up all the miles of plant for that 1 mile of nothing where there's no connections, but then all the potential customers that you have per the miles of all the streets in this new development. And if it comes out and it's an aerial plant and it's 30 homes per mile of total, they have to go. All right? If it's underground, 60 homes per mile. If you had a development out here that by itself met the density requirements, but we've got 4 miles of just open space between where the city boundary ends and where this unincorporated development is, so that you couldn't say you've got 30 homes per mile when you add those 4 miles plus, you know, the 45 or 50 houses that are there. But now there's been new developments encroaching, and now you're getting closer. At some point, the cable system now ends here, and now there's only 1.5 miles left of open space. At whatever point you meet that density requirement, under the existing franchise, Comcast would have the obligation to extend. So if you are aware of a development where you have I wonder if they qualify. I know they don't get service. I wonder if they meet the density requirements. It's a fair question to ask any of your government representatives here. Can you check and see how many miles of roads do we have in this development? How far away is the cable system? Would it apply? Hans has something he'd like to add to that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's accurate, and we from time to time we get the requests through the county, and we go out and take a look, and you know, we want your business. And again, as I said, though, at the end of the day, it has to make sense because there's nobody to help subsidize that. The other component here, though, is also the service into the home, right? So we talk about homes past 30 aerial, 60 under, and then there's the issue of you're 300 yards in off the street. You know, in some of these rural areas, you got to go in deep off the right-of-way to get to that home. That's that's another component of the system, if you will. So when we talk about the density, that'll get the plant out on the street. Now, standard installation is 125 feet. Beyond that, that service drop, loses capacity. So now we've got to bring heavier line in, or if it's an underground situation, you've got to trench in that basically called service drop in that 300 to 500 feet. If it's in beyond that, now we're talking about actually building distribution into that. So that now becomes the problem of that individual resident or property owner, because it's their private property that has to be constructed well into. So that's another component just to keep in mind.
Not to monopolize this further, but is there a reason per the county right-of-way agreement, the way I've been explained by our local Comcast rep, is that we can personally hire a subcontractor to do our private road because it's a private road, and so we have the utility easement there, and we can have the subcontractor we want go ahead and I believe it's conduit cables that we would be laying, and then we would have our Comcast reps supervise the work to make sure it's done in compliance with county standards. But once we hit the county road, that's when everything falls into your hands as Comcast. And a mile away from our house, so what my understanding is that Comcast then outsources, because the contractors we had do it were all from Idaho, every single subcontractor there. So is there a reason why it can't be opened up and be a little bit more competitive? Like, for example, our neighbors, our contractors, is there a reason why they can't bid on that process, or why they can't bid on that job too? And why we couldn't have somebody local do the work for us versus hiring a Comcast subcontractor for that county road?
Right. Well, because we have contractors, again, that are specifically trained to build our plant in accordance with our spec, in accordance with meeting the FCC technical standards, that sort of thing. This isn't something that just any contractor can do. We have those that we use. And so when it comes to the public right-of-way, no, you cannot encroach upon that. That's what we have got to do. I think you referenced earlier something about service and neighbors and all of that. There is an equal and uniform service provision within all of our franchises, right? We need to serve everybody equally. We can't pick winners and losers in terms of, well, we're not going to serve you because you didn't, you know. So all I would say is generally speaking, the more folks in an area that say, yes, I want the service, the better business case there is for us to expand into areas that would not necessarily.
We're at that 20. Like, we're literally right on the fence. So, I mean, maybe we can talk afterwards or something about if there's any way Comcast will work with us in our neighborhood, because it's a pretty frustrating position to be in when, like, we literally would be willing to pay you guys the money, but the issue is then that the people that won't pay the money for that new construction cost, like you said, per the county franchise agreement, at least that's what we've been told, is it's the county franchise agreement, because of the cables being in the right of way, that, like you said, prevent the freeze out of other people that wouldn't be willing
right.
to
So keep in mind,
share.
even at the 30, right, we're still footing a big portion of that build. So even though customers are, you know, so we're gonna build that in a situation like this where, you know, you've got 20. Right, now you're going to have to make up that difference to kind of get to 30. But even then, you know, we're spending some money to get service there. I don't know the details particularly, but I mean, just generally speaking, that's how it works. And of course, no, we can't make those other 10 folks chip in if they don't want it.
I think I figured out what I didn't understand about your question before. What you're saying is if some of the neighbors pitch in and we build the network on the private roads out to the public road, and then Comcast extends their network and they hook into that, can we keep those of our neighbors who didn't pay us for this out? I think there's a way you can do that. Let's talk afterwards.
Well, that assuming basically they don't build service drops to those homes.
Well, yeah. I mean, if these are private streets and private rights-of-way, and you can create a private entity that will build the neighborhood infrastructure, you can create a framework that says the initial people who pay for this are going to pay a pro rata cost of doing it. And anybody else who wants to tie into it at a later point will recalculate the numbers, and if they pay their pro rata cost, to reimburse those people who fronted the money to get this service here.
That would be basically, we wouldn't deal with you as an individual customer. Your whole housing development would be one customer to us. We would have a service agreement with that. You would have to work out amongst your neighbors.
Well, is this an HOA? These are individual lot owners. So you would only have contracts with individual customers, and if the smaller group here, sorry everybody we can talk more. Not even an HOA, you could form a nonprofit community broadband organization to fund local infrastructure. That entity signs an agreement with Comcast, and then they provide service over that entity, and they can maintain it, but you can keep people who haven't initially bought into that community nonprofit out unless they pay their fair share. There's a way to do this.
Yeah, I'd say our relationship would be with that nonprofit / HOA, whatever it may be. So we would not be involved with the local politics, so to speak.
The neighborhood politics, which are even worse than local politics, right? Right, the hyper-local politics. Good. Okay, have we solved the problems of the world tonight? Yes, sir. Use the mic, please. Thank you.
Olympia. Our HOA had a contract with Comcast. It was a 10-year contract, and we were tied into a certain monthly fee per household. And what happened was, over the years, Comcast retail rates for individual homes dropped below our contractor rate, and Comcast will not renegotiate with us to make it more fair. So everybody want to bail out of the HOA program. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Okay. Other comments? We don't want to kick you out if you have something to say. Yep. Okay. So yeah, if we're done with this part of Q&A and neighborhood feedback, I just want to reiterate some of the information I had on the slide. So it's now the end of July. We're hoping by the end of August or the middle of September, we'll have that financial audit done. We'll have the technical audit done, and we will then be conveying as a negotiating team to analyze all this information and say, what does this mean? What are we going to do with it? What are our priorities? Look, in any negotiation, I don't know how many of you have been in business, but this is not unique to cable. You go into any complex commercial negotiation. What are our top 5 or 6 priorities that we'd like to see in this next franchise? I think a lot of people heard tonight that TCM is one of those priorities. So what are we willing to go to the mat on? What are we willing to give up on? We're going to have that internal discussion is the same way that Hans and his folks are probably going to have that discussion. And then we're going to sit down and start talking. We'll probably come up with a franchise draft and propose it to Comcast, and we'll get their feedback. And I suspect that we will not be done by Christmas, but hopefully sometime in 2019 we will have a new franchise agreement. At any point in the process, if you have questions about where are you in the process, how are things going, call your government representative who's here tonight, and they will share that information with you. When the franchise process is completed, if we do come to an agreement, we, of course, are just staff. All we can do is recommend an agreement to your elected officials. So each jurisdiction will have a public hearing required by law. So it will be, published on the web, in the newspaper, if they're still doing that. And you will have an opportunity to come in and talk in a public hearing to your elected officials as to whether you think it's a good deal or not a good deal. And then the elected officials will vote on it. That is the way the process works, and that's where we go from here. And hopefully it will not be too drawn out and too frustrating, but it is a complex and oftentimes difficult issue because for all the reasons that we've discussed tonight. So, Kelly.
Thank you, Ken, for the evening, and thanks, Hans, for being here as well. Thank you all for coming. I'm a little sad because I was hoping for a franchise agreement for Christmas, and now I'm not going to get one. But I I wanted to, before you go, I wanted to give you one more reminder about the written comment sheets. Take advantage of that. If there's someone out in the world you want to share that with, go ahead, you can mail it in to us. Also, I wanted to remind you that our survey, online survey, is still live. Take advantage of that. Encourage others. We do want to hear from people because that's how we make good decisions. I want to thank my friends and colleagues from Lacey and Tumwater and the county for being here this evening and for their support, because someone thanked me, but it's all of us. This is a joint endeavor. So having said that, thank you and have a great evening.